and welcome to the Motivational Millennial Podcast. I'm Ivy LeClaire.
And I'm Blake Brandis.
Welcome to our reflection session.
Inspired fire time.
Inspired fire pit? Bonfire? Wait, where was I going with this? Okay.
Our bond fire. Because we're taking the wisdom from our guests and bonding with it and each other and our listeners.
This is a bonfire.
A bond fire. Could also be what happens if you burn a collection of 007 tapes. A bonfire.
Oh, that's sad.
I know. That's not an inspired bonfire. That's a sad fire bonfire. Anyway, hi.
So we're going to have a conversation about our takeaways from the interview with Anna Nti-Asare that was last week's episode. Anna just started her PhD at Cambridge this fall and is doing a lot of work at the intersection of race, gender, and education. So if you haven't checked out that episode, we encourage you to do so. It was an amazing conversation. So this week's theme for our bonfire, we're trying to come up with a new name for it, but this is the after show, the new version of the after show for people who are wondering. Bonfire. So the new theme for this week is Humanness and Happiness.
That was a really good title.
Thank you. I feel so excited about it, apparently. Humanness and Happiness. And how this relates to what I would love to share, what I really took away from the conversation. I really loved, there were so many amazing things, but one of the things that stood out to me was when she was sharing about her childhood and how she lived in many different places around the world as her folks moved around. And how one of the things that she learned was that human beings, even though the cultures are different and, specific desires are different, that there's always this desire for happiness and passion. And those are things that really drive humans, no matter who they are or where they're from. And I thought that was a really great perspective, because I think one of the things that can be really challenging about the human experience is that we can isolate ourselves to the point where we feel like in our own minds that we're the only one that's having the exact experience that we're having. Mm-hmm. So if we're experiencing depression or anxiety or even just disappointment or grief, it's very personal, but it's also impersonal in the fact that every human experiences those similar emotions. And when we understand and remind ourselves of our common humanness, it can leave us feeling less isolated and less alone and more like, oh my gosh, it's not just me that's having this experience. And I'm really reminded about the fact that human beings have not changed a lot over the years, because I study Theravada Buddhism, and in this lens, it's also insight meditation or Vipassana meditation, Western mindfulness. It has many names, but the teachings of the Buddha are all about the mind and how human beings have in their own nature to want to push away experiences that are bad, experiences that we don't want to have happen, and to grasp onto experiences that we want to stay, and many other things. But there's some really basic psychology. If you're listening to Buddha psychology, you're like, oh my gosh, this is happening in my own mind right now. And what blows my mind about it is that, the Buddha and his fellow teachers were writing about this 2,600 years ago, and human beings are still suffering with the same sort of mental inner critic, ego, self-doubt, all of these things still. It's just a different external mask. And so, I love learning about Buddha Dharma because I'm reminded of the human experience and the fact that what's going on for me and in my mind, I'm not alone. It's not personal to me,
Yeah, and one of the main elements of humanness that you mentioned is desire to avoid uncomfortable or unpleasant experiences. And one of the things I loved that Anna touched on was, even though she didn't get the scholarships that she wanted to the first couple times around, she was able to later be grateful for it. And one of the things that really reminded me of is, how much of our suffering could we reduce if we just reduce the lag time for when we're grateful of it? So instead of being grateful for the unfortunate things that are happening later, what if we can be grateful for them 5 minutes after they happen? Like just decreasing that delay. And something that happened to me recently made me really think about this, which was, I was bicycling home with a bag of balloons for a friend's party, and a group of teenagers was on the bike path, and I saw them and I was like, oh, should I avoid them? Okay, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And as I cycled by, one of them jumped out and she grabbed the bag of balloons and dragged me from the bike, and I hit the bike path hard. And, I was obviously shocked, and she just laughed and walked away with her friends. And, within the first couple minutes, I was just outraged. I said, why would you do something like that? I'm just a dude, cycling with some balloons. Like, what kind of, mind do you have to want to do that to somebody? And then a couple minutes later, I was just like, this is a good exercise in gratitude. What can I be grateful for? Was the question I asked. So I was grateful for the fact I was wearing jeans, so I didn't scrape up my legs more than I happened to. I was grateful for the fact that my bicycle, after a couple minutes, was able to work again. I was grateful for the fact that miraculously none of the balloons popped despite being dragged to the ground along with me. And it's a small thing, but I think it was a good reminder that we, in the moment, are going to feel whatever emotions we feel. But then after that, can we look for things to be grateful for and how that experience can be working for us?
And I think that what that does is it helps with acceptance. Like when we talk about radical acceptance, I think we've talked about it before, at least there's a blog post written about it somewhere. Mm-hmm. But it's so interesting because from the outside perspective, radical acceptance can sort of feel like it means that you accept the way you're being treated. That in that moment you could have been like, well, I guess that's just the way it's supposed to be. Like that acceptance means resignation or something in some way. But really, the acceptance is in the fact that it either has already happened, or it is happening currently. Like the acceptance is in not fighting against the experience that you have already had or the experience that you're having, so that you can approach it in a way that you want to approach it. It's so that you aren't being reactionary. Because when we get stuck on resistance or pushing away, or this shouldn't have happened, or this is injustice, then we are much more likely to be reactionary and come at it from anger or fear or all of these things, right? But I mean, a simple way to do it, like that you're suggesting, is practicing gratitude, because you're accepting that this thing that was uncool just happened. And then to take that extra bit of saying, I'm grateful for it, it gets you in the habit, your brain in the habit of not being so reactionary. And that ultimately results in more peace over time.
Yeah, and you're right, because it also brought me back to my purpose, which was, okay, I want to continue to help students in their formative years so that fewer students decide that that kind of behavior is a good thing, and that fewer people have to suffer what I suffered. So you're absolutely right. It wasn't radical acceptance in the sense of like, oh, I guess I just deserve to get dragged from my bike and, splattered on the bike path. But it was the radical acceptance of saying, okay, this has happened. How can I use this to help me do more of what I want to do in the world?
And so how this really relates to, we've talked a little bit about how it relates to humanness, right? Like sort of the human nature to sort of push away things that we don't want to have happening. But I think it relates to the happiness piece. Anna was talking about how humans just kind of want to be happy. And I think what's really interesting is that the more you practice gratitude and the more you practice self-compassion and like being really aware through mindfulness of what you're actually experiencing, sort of this other universal truth of humanness is that people are trying to reduce their own suffering. Like literally, that's the motivator for like everything that humans do. Whether it's conscious or not is the difference. And that's what mindfulness brings to you, is a consciousness, an awareness of why you're making the decisions that you're making or saying the things that you're saying, so that you can bring forth like an actual real way to reduce your suffering instead of all of these other ways, like eating a lot or making people feel bad or pulling people off the bike so you can have a momentary feeling of powerfulness, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't know, I think there's something really important about, it doesn't mean that it's easy, it doesn't mean that it's right, but that's the reality, is that there is this motivator for happiness and a reduction of suffering that is the reason that people pretty much do anything ever.
Yeah, and I think often reducing suffering is a higher priority for people than actively seeking happiness. And so that looks like it takes a form of escapism, it takes a form of addiction,
Right.
It takes a form, like you said, of abuse. And it also makes sense when you think about psychological studies that show how powerful loss aversion is. That people are much more incentivized to avoid losing $100 than to gain 20.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, in terms of relative motivation.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm going to learn more. Do you know more about this, or what are the implications of this?
Yeah, I'd have to revisit the studies. What it shows is that it's harder to get people to go towards something if they feel like they're having to give up something they really care about. So losing weight is a key example where this plays out. And I think the book is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg that does a lot of the studies in this. And it specifically talks about if you feel you're having to give up foods that you love or activities that you really enjoy, like watching television, that is a stronger draw than the theoretical happiness that will come from being more in shape, or the longevity that will come from being in shape, or the health that will follow from that.
And I think really the irony often is that the food or whatever it is that people aren't wanting to give up, that's attachment, right?
Yeah.
That's the opposite. It's either you're pushing away or you're clinging,
Mm-hmm.
because it's been the thing that has made you feel temporarily happy. Yeah. So you don't want to let go of it.
And it usually doesn't actually fulfill us, which is what you're saying. Like
mostly never.
Yeah.
Like
we feel like
capitalism.
Oh, gosh, I couldn't give this thing up. And then you go for a week without it. You're like, what? I needed it. I feel that way sometimes about social media when I travel or something. I haven't had time to check Facebook for a week. And I'm like, wow, life really wasn't negatively impacted by not checking my newsfeed every 5 minutes.
Yeah, it's so funny. I guess I just want to make a caveat here. Not a caveat, but I do want to be clear on the fact that it's like I've been studying these concepts for years, and I also just got back from a week-long Vipassana meditation retreat recently, so I'm really inundated in the teachings, but that doesn't mean that I like 100% execute them or something.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it sounds like I'm like, oh yes, I do. I mean, I can understand it, but it's so like, that's why it's a practice, right? Like with anything, with exercise, with anything that you do, it's an ongoing practice. Personal development and growth is an ongoing practice. And so I wanted to be clear that, there are definitely things that, like, I know that eating Ben & Jerry's ice cream isn't really fulfilling me, but when I'm feeling really stressed out, it makes me feel a little bit happy, and, so I just go with it, and that's okay, and that's, like, normal. Do I also have habits and practices in place that will help cultivate a more sustaining peace and a sustaining source of happiness? Yes, but I'm not the Buddha. And that's because we're all human, right? So we're all having that human experience. I didn't want there to be this irony of like us talking about humanness and it sort of sounding like that I like don't ever have those habits.
Oh yeah, we definitely put the human and the humanness and happiness.
Yeah, that's so important for us, I feel, in this podcast and on the show, to just be open and vulnerable with you all, the listeners, about where we are, because sometimes in the personal development field, we can really focus on needing to show the things that we've learned and the ways that we've grown, which is really important, but then don't always talk about the actual struggle and what it really looked like, so that the people who are listening, who are actually in the midst of struggle or are resisting something that's going on in their life or grasping to something that's going on in their lives, which basically we all are, you can know that that's totally a normal part of the human experience.
Yeah. And, for me, one of the reasons I wanted to share the bike story was because it felt like a celebration of a moment when I did manage to do that. Because normally I think I'm just so hard. I'm especially hard on myself whenever I disappoint myself. So when someone else has disappointed me, it felt nice to have a moment. I was like, oh, wow, I actually was really happy with the way I responded to that. Yeah, because that can definitely be an aberration sometimes and is not the norm.
Yeah. And I think that, what was so cool about Anna and her story about the multiple times that she applied for several different scholarships and the Gates Scholarship, and how afterwards she looked back on it and was able to really feel grateful for, right, to your point, and recognize the ways in which her life actually turned out really well because those things didn't happen, right? So one of the things about being grateful for whatever thing has just happened to you, even if it seems not good on the outside, or even if it's not good to experience, or even if it's loss or grief or there's pain happening, having the gratitude in the moment for whatever there is able to have gratitude for allows you to get the positive experience of what's happening while you're in it, rather than waiting and going, oh, like resisting for 2 years or something, like beating yourself up over not having gotten that scholarship for 2 years. You could have done that.
Oh, yeah,
but
and that's so hard, because there are so many times when we look and think, oh, I wish I'd said that, I wish I'd done that, blah blah blah, and yeah, the regret, and I've been there. I've just been in stuff that takes months, even years to get over, and it feels like a siren is going off in your head for a number of years, like there's an emergency that you just can't fix. To use some acoustic metaphors here. That are currently part of our experience. Yeah, so I think you're right, and it's a high goal. I'll say that. It's a high goal, but it's one worth continuously attempting to achieve, to the extent that conversations like this can be a reminder for ourselves and for you, our listener. Thank you for the opportunity for that, and for witnessing us reminding ourselves as well.
Absolutely. And also just never underestimating the importance of practicing gratitude when it occurs to you, and practicing awareness and compassion for yourself, even if it's once every 2 months or something, like you're building a habit and you're having those moments, and nothing can take that away. And I think sometimes, at least, I can feel like, okay, I'm being really mindful for a whole day, and then like a couple of days pass, or 3 days pass, or a month pass, and I'm like, what is mindfulness? And feel like then I'm not getting any benefit at all, or something like that. So I just want to affirm, people who are developing that kind of practice, and know that it's not like you develop the practice and instantaneously you're like permanently grateful every minute.
Sure.
Having gratitude for your moments of gratitude.
Ooh, it's so meta. I love it.
Wonderful.
Well, we'll triple that gratitude and say we're thankful for you for listening to the Motivational Millennial Podcast, and to Anna for sharing her wisdom and her journey with us. And we hope you tune in next week for another interview with a rockin' millennial. And in the meantime, don't forget to be awesome.
Don't forget to be awesome. For show notes and previous episodes, or to learn more about our coaching and event offerings, visit motivationalmillennial.com. That's millennial, MILLENNIAL. Keep in touch with us at facebook.com/motivationalmillennial.
We'd love to hear from you. Shoot us an email with your thoughts, comments, and suggestions at podcast@motivationalmillennial.com. And tell us who you might like to hear from, or if you think you or anyone you know would be good for the show.
Our theme music was composed and performed by our very own Blake Brandis.
The Motivational Millennial Podcast is edited by Brittany Felix. Have a great week, motivational millennials.